Welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Well, one of the issues that's been really, front page in the last year in Toronto has been Sidewalks, this proposal that the parent company for Google had to really recreate a new, urban environment downtown Toronto on the waterfront with, huge technological advances that some people thought was going to be like Big Brother. And I really want to know more about this. And so a friend of mine, an old friend of mine, someone who I think very highly of from old Mississauga politics is LaRose Mercader, who was the manager of communications and public engagement at Waterfront Toronto, responsible for Sidewalk Toronto. No longer with that position because of what's happened. He's now the manager of the York Eglinton BIA. Has joined us. And LaRose, thanks for coming on my show. How are you?
Brian, thank you so much for having me. I'm doing really well. It's beautiful outside.
So tell me, what was your job?
Yeah, and so at Waterfront Toronto, we were responsible for this particular site along the Toronto waterfront, and it was called Quayside. And for those who are not familiar, Quayside is along Queens Quay, just before you get to Cherry, so it's just south of the Distillery District and the Garner Expressway. So Waterfront Toronto, so we're a government agency, and we own 12 acres of land there. And so we were responsible for helping develop sort of the community plan in partnership with Alphabet, which is a parent company of Google. And so I was responsible for all the communications and public engagement for the project. So it was a 2-year endeavor to engage the people of Toronto on reimagining a brand new neighborhood from the internet up.
And it died. Why do you think it died?
Yeah, sadly, a few weeks ago it was announced that Alphabet had decided not to proceed with the proposal. And I think just from being in the project, I think their ambition was a lot bigger than the site that we had been proposing. So initially, the RFP that went out around the world, and which Alphabet won, was for this 12-acre site. But the proposal that they came up with was something a lot larger and a lot bigger in scale. And for those not familiar with Toronto, they're also redeveloping the Portlands area, where they're rebuilding the Don River, which would open up about 500 acres of new land, which is about the size of downtown Toronto if you think about it. So the proposal they were bringing forward included a big chunk of that land, and unfortunately that was beyond the scope of what Waterfront Toronto was looking for. And also I think a lot of the things that they were proposing weren't proven yet. And part of my teams was to listen to the community, and obviously there was a lot of, especially in the media, a lot of concerns about data and privacy. Yeah.
Go ahead.
And so I think there was a lot of skeptical people in terms of how that would operate.
Let's come back to the data and privacy in a second, if we could. So it's a real shame because, at least I think it is, because this is a derelict part, almost a wasteland of our waterfront that, I'm not sure all that was there was the Distillery District, and thankfully it's been completely redone and reopened, and it's beautiful. But the balance of it is nothing other than wasteland, is it? And this was going to be really quite an exciting redevelopment. So am I right that it's a huge shame that this has occurred?
Yeah, I mean, this was going to be the first of its kind in the world. And, we know that governments and local governments don't have the funds and means to build a lot of this necessary infrastructure, let alone new innovative technologies. So to have the world's largest tech firm willing to invest billions of dollars into our city and no longer proceeding with it, I think is a huge loss. And part of my responsibility was actually welcoming and giving tours to international delegations. So I probably gave 24 tours to people from like Saudi Arabia, Singapore, Japan, all over Europe, who are really looking Toronto in terms of like what we were doing here and how can we form this sort of public-private partnership to build an innovative new community. So for us not to proceed with it, I think it's a huge loss. But on the flip side, Alphabet had spent about $40 million planning this 12 acres. And that's about the same budget to plan for the whole city of Toronto in 1 year in the planning department. So a lot of that great sort of planning work has gone into planning this neighborhood. So hopefully we can take pieces of that and actually implement and integrate that across Toronto. But also I think there's lessons for Mississauga to learn and to take away as well as we develop our waterfront.
So the plans, the intellectual property in the plans, is that property that we can make use of, or is that proprietary to Alphabet?
No, it's publicly accessible and owned by Waterfront Toronto, which is fantastic. And all that, all the plans are also available online. So I think the website is quaysideto.ca, where all the public documents are available, including sort of a 3-volume proposal that Sidewalk had released last summer. And so I know it's a lot to take in, but I think for those who are really interested, it's a great sort of read in and look into what they were proposing.
Do you think the city did what everything they should do to try to keep the plan going ahead, or were they right to let it go?
I think so. I think that we did everything we could. The other interesting thing about Waterfront Toronto is that it's the only government agency that has to report to all 3 levels of government. So if you think about the coordination piece between the federal ministries, the provincial government, and the city of Toronto, for all those players to come together so quickly to decide that they wanted to partner or potentially partner with Sidewalk Toronto, I think was ambitious. And then also, I think just the dynamics of working between the public and private sectors, there was a lot of great synergy in between those two. So I think it comes down to an unfortunate set of circumstances with timing, especially with COVID-19 now, and just the market not being there like it was a few years ago. But I think Toronto, and especially the business community, a lot of the academic institutions and a lot of great organizations and community groups had come together and really wanted to work with labs to make this happen.
We're chatting tonight with LaRose Mercader about Sidewalks and Waterfront Toronto. We're going to take a break for some messages. Stay with us. We're going to come right back in just a minute. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm joined tonight by LaRose Mercader, who is the former manager of communications and public engagement for Waterfront Toronto, responsible for Sidewalk Toronto, the big development on 12 acres of land on our waterfront. He's now left that position and he's working for the York Eglinton BIA. LaRose, let's come back and talk about some of these issues. So one of the big issues that got a lot of concern was this sort of big brother or data that they were going to collect a whole bunch of information about where we walked and how we crossed the street and how much garbage we threw out and how much water we took. And they said that we would, they'd be able to provide services and infrastructure more effectively to us and anticipate our needs. And then the counter to that was they were going to know everything we were doing, and it was going to be too much information. Where did you come out on that?
Yeah, and that was the number one issue that we heard in all of our community consultations, is that people were afraid that that this neighborhood was sort of going to be a Big Brother neighborhood when everything would be monitored by Google. And those concerns were going to be addressed. Part of the things at Waterfront Toronto was we established this great sort of panel that we brought all these amazing experts together, and it was called the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel, or DSAP. And this panel was really brought the whole community together, and they had really provided their recommendations around digital governance, the legal and the accountability pieces to that. And part of the thing that needed to happen is that this was a sort of a new space that a lot of governments hadn't developed any sort of new legislation around. And so it was a new topic. So I think that part of the piece that we had failed in is sort of educating the public on what this exactly means. And how do we protect the public good around this, and who was going to be the stewardship of sort of the data that was going to be gathered in this new neighborhood. So there was some, yeah.
When John Tory ran for mayor, I remember him talking about smart traffic lights and that would speed traffic dramatically. And so he was talking about the benefit of data. Lots of different companies have talked about smart cities in regards to electricity and water, and
Yeah.
people are enjoying the differential pricing that we've got on electricity. So and when you think about cookies on our websites and suggestions that Google makes of what we might be interested in or Amazon makes, we're getting this kind of information daily. Why did people react so negatively to this happening sort of in the real world, not just our virtual world, do you think?
I actually think the majority of people really understood that data is something that they needed to opt in as part of this new neighborhood. I think a lot of us, obviously a majority of the population has, mobile devices, and we click on sort of the terms and references when we want to share our information with a private company. Obviously, most people, I think, need to take more time to actually read what the terms and references are. And also tech companies are being a lot more diligent to have sort of plain language on what it actually means by clicking yes. But also there was sort of a very strong, vocal, organized group in Toronto that was really opposed to any sort of involvement with a giant tech firm. And that obviously generated a lot of media attention in Toronto. And really, but on the flip side, I think it actually made the project even more better. I think it really forced Waterfront Toronto and Alphabet and government agencies to demand that we have an open and accountable and transparent process, what it means to actually be part of a smart new neighborhood. And I think that's really the wave of the future for all cities that we're moving forward, especially when we go out into sort of public-private spaces on what it actually means to connect to the internet or being part of a private building. And you're right, just the security features. And if you're living in a building, what does that mean in terms of controlling the AC or the HVAC equipment in your building? So there's trade-offs to obviously technology, but in the end of the day, I think it came down to a lack of education. And that's something that cities need to really take responsibility for in terms of getting sort of the digital literacy piece up from our population. And one of the things that we started working in Toronto is actually working with our public libraries, the Toronto Public Library, in terms of educating people about what this actually means moving forward into the future. And I think that's something that we need to start exploring to do here in Mississauga.
There was also some issue about using wood, and people felt uncomfortable with the amount of wood they were using. Tell us about that.
Yeah, one of the proposals was that this new neighborhood was going to use tall timber. And so all the buildings, about 6,000 units, was going to use this sort of especially treated compressed wood, which has actually been used a lot in places like Europe. And surprisingly, here in Canada, we have a huge lumber industry, but there's only sort of one mill in Quebec that made this sort of special wood that's fire resistant. And the other issues we had is like with mice and rodents and other animals eat away at this. So it's specially treated to this. And I think a good example in Mississauga is if you go to Credit Valley Hospital and the main entrance or the wing there has this sort of special timber wood that we were proposing for this neighborhood. So they were proposing to build buildings as tall as 30 stories using just this special kind of timber. And it would have really given a special sort of unique look and feel to the neighborhood. As you know, most places in downtown Toronto and even here in Mississauga, we just have tall glass buildings. So to see sort of a beautiful new wooden structure, I think would have been really cool.
Why were people so against it? Why were people so against it?
Yeah, I don't think there were people who were against it. I think they were just skeptical of whether or not this was even possible, especially the Ontario Building Code currently allows, I think, less than 8 or 10 stories that it could actually go up to. But I think when we started educating the public about what this means, that we could create possibly a whole new industry in Ontario and create thousands of new jobs, I think people warmed up to the idea.
Size is one of the other issues you mentioned. Why did they want so much more size? Was it necessary for them to make their economics?
Yeah, definitely. I think in order to meet sort of their business case, and you remember Alphabet is a private company, they need to, and especially if they were going to invest all this money in new, innovative new technology and all the infrastructure underground, they needed sort of scale to make this happen. The other goal of the neighborhood was that it was going to be a truly carbon neutral neighborhood. And so if you're thinking about sort of the heating and cooling systems and centralized systems that needed to happen, they needed scale to make that happen. And so that's why they were proposing to go beyond the 12 acres. I think they were looking at about 180 is what they were proposing, which is basically the same size as the Lakeview property here in Mississauga.
Yeah, 12 acres going to 180 is a little bit of an increase.
Yeah.
Where are those 180? Was that the whole Portlands area?
No, I think that would be about half of it right now. The Portlands area is about 450 acres, I believe. And right now, Waterfront Toronto is working on rediverting the Don River and the mouth of the Don River there right now. So right now, you couldn't be able to build, down to that land because it floods every once in a while. So to be able to open up all this land is going to be a remarkable transformation of what's going on in Toronto's waterfront.
But the Portlands area is not as derelict as the 12 acres we were just talking about, but it's all sort of old industrial and could really
Yeah.
use a redevelopment. Why didn't the city entertain that idea?
I think part of it is just the way that the RFP is initially structured. It focused on finding a funding and innovation partner specifically for the 12 acres. There was a caveat in the RFP that they could potentially look at expanding the scope in the future. But the real focus had to be that Alphabet had to prove themselves on the 12 acres first before they actually thought about expanding to the rest of the waterfront. So I think perhaps if we had structured the RFP to include all of the Portlands, I think this would have been a different story. And I think people were saying that perhaps if we were going to allow Sidewalk Toronto or Sidewalk Labs to take on the Portlands, it was unfair because we didn't allow other private firms to fairly bid and bring proposals to that land. And so this is a key part of Toronto's infrastructure, so it has to be done correctly and fairly. And that's why it was forced. Sidewalk Toronto actually backed down, and they had downscaled their proposal back to the initial 12 acres. And I think that's also the reason why they decided that it just didn't make economic sense for them to proceed.
Transit was also one of their requests, was it not?
It was, and it was one of our key demands as well. For those who are familiar with Toronto, there's the LRT that goes along the waterfront, but it only goes on the western edge towards the CNE. And there were plans to take the LRT to the east side towards the Don River. And so we were looking at a funding model where they would help pay for that new infrastructure. And also, it made economic sense for them to make the neighborhood a lot more accessible and sort of pedestrian friendly. And so that was part of the plan. And part of the package moving forward was they were going to make a large financial contribution to that.
Do you think there's any chance we could get them to come back?
I wish, I think one of the things if I was to do this again, and this is just, coulda, shoulda, woulda, if I was a province of Ontario, one of the sites that really needs help right now is Ontario Place. And, a lot of the big things was about the sort of the governance issue around this. So the fact that that's all provincially owned land that's needing sort of infrastructure and investment would have been a great sort of test bed and site for Alphabet to actually test bed all these new ideas. And so hopefully, somebody in government is maybe perhaps proposing new ideas. And I think that would be an ideal scenario.
I should have mentioned in my introduction that I came across LaRose initially, I think because of your involvement in the Mississauga Summit, and then because you ran for ward council. Was it twice that you ran for ward council?
That's right. In 2000, oh no, actually three times, 2010, 14, and the latest election in 2018.
And so LaRose has got a great amount of political experience. Let me ask you a political leadership question.
Mhm.
You know, I think about, you mentioned Ontario Place. I would also mention an Exhibition Place. I could also mention, you know, we were thinking about an Olympic bid. Um,
Yeah.
we've got, you know, the redevelopment of this 12 acres, the redevelopment of the whole Portland's area. It's do we have the right political leadership to get stuff done? Like, you know, you think about the Trillium line, you know, Premier Doug Ford said it's just going to get done. And, you know, almost surprised everyone because he had it all designed and planned and funded, and it's a fait accompli, something that we had never thought about before in the whole big move stuff. But in some of these things, people, you know, desperately want public involvement and public consultation. But when we do all that, maybe it just doesn't ever get done and we end up getting nowhere.
Yeah. That's a really good question, Brian. And I think if you look at other large successful projects in other cities around the world, it really, it needs, any big projects needs sort of a political champion to make it happen. And you're right, I think that is lacking for projects in the GTA. I mean, if we looked at, you know, just for Mississauga, we had, you know, former Mayor Hazel McCallion, you know, deciding to build our city center area. Who would have thought that we could transform a you know, piece of farmland into a booming city center 30 years later, and the rest of Mississauga, obviously. And yeah, I think, and if you look at other places like Chicago, in terms of building massive new infrastructure, sort of like, you know, Millennium Park and stuff like that, they had a sort of strong mayor system. Unfortunately, I think the way that our political system here is in Ontario and in the GTA doesn't allow for sort of that, sort of those strong players to emerge. Perhaps a good example recently is the Premier, and you're right, with this Ontario line, a lot of people are skeptical
Sorry,
whether
Ontario
or
line,
not.
not Trillium line. You're right. I had the wrong
Yes,
name.
the Ontario, it's called the Ontario line because it would connect the Ontario Place with the Ontario Science Center. Is, you know, people don't believe that it's actually going to happen. And I think today they just announced that they were releasing the RFPs to advance the project. And so, yeah, I think the failure of the Sidewalk Labs proposal is we didn't have that strong political champion to really push it forward. I think initially they did, and, you know, the political cycles obviously changed. And it's unfortunate. But I think if we are going to think big and to make things happen, we need sort of these new political leaders to emerge and not to be afraid to share their big ideas and to execute on them.
I always continue to worry about NIMBYism, that it's easier for people, a small, you know, vocal minority group to say no to almost anything, rather than it's difficult to get a whole bunch of people to say yes to something.
Yeah, agreed. But I actually think the NIMBYism, you know, a lot of times makes the projects a lot more accountable and transparent, and actually makes the project even better if it does proceed. But I think it's getting over sort of like the initial hump and the opposition to it that sort of we haven't been successful in. But just, you know, a good example is this, what Waterfront Toronto is doing. So yes, we were focused on that 12-acre site, but right now we're redeveloping the entire Portlands, which is amazing, which is 450 acres. And that was a plan that's been developed for the last 30 years, Brian. And so it took 30 years for the three levels of government to agree to $1 billion. And it actually, the idea started because we wanted to bid for the Olympics for 2008. And that's how Waterfront Toronto actually got created, is because we had this crazy idea that we wanted to host the Olympics there. So even though we didn't win, you know, 30 years later, we're spending $1 billion to reclaim this part of the city. So even though we're not really good at executing the big projects in a timely manner, I think in the long run, eventually these good ideas come around and eventually gets funded, but it takes a good long amount of time to make things happen here.
We're chatting tonight with LaRose Mercader, former manager of communications and community relations for the Waterfront Toronto and responsible for Sidewalk Toronto. A great guy, future politician for sure, and a great asset to Mississauga and the GTA. Thanks, LaRose, for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian. Take care.
Thank you.